Oh, great catch.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Sorry
Recording?
about that.
All good. No.
And we have Wanda, our amazing minute taker. Thank you, Wanda, so much. So I manage a program called Farm to School BC. It's a provincially funded healthy eating program supported by the province of British Columbia and the Provincial Health Services Authority. It's a healthy eating program that promotes food literacy for K-12 students. The three core pillars of Farm to School BC are healthy local food, hands-on learning, and school and community connectedness. I'll talk about something that we talked about during our previous session that really made me want to have a further conversation about was about inclusiveness and about really seeing myself as part of this program. So I'll get into that a little bit more, but I do want to say that Farm to School BC, we do take an equity approach, and something that we've done is to make sure that the food literacy activities that we're promoting are as flexible as possible. Something that is very popular and widely known is the salad bar model. And I just want to say from my own perspective and my own story is that the salad bar really was a foreign concept to me. It's not something that I grew up with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So when I came into this role, I thought about how can other people see themselves being part of this program? So that flexibility and that local adaptation was a really important part in making sure that the program that Farm to School BC is as inclusive as possible. So the ranges of program really vary from school gardens, microgreens, smoothies, and beyond. When we ask schools to see themselves as the part of Farm to School BC activities, we try not to be prescriptive. Instead, we ask the school and communities what it is that they want to achieve. So really, at the end of the day, we're talking about supporting local food systems. We ask the schools and the students to ask themselves how they want to engage with their local growers, the local NGOs, the local First Nations, and how they see themselves as a part of the broader school community network. We have 6 regional hubs across the province, and we have community animators that work within each of the regions, really recognizing and acknowledging that local adaptation and the opportunities as well as the challenges are important to acknowledge when you're trying to deliver a successful program. So we work with various rural and remote communities, Indigenous communities, and vulnerable populations.
Thanks, Richard. And so as mentioned, I'm the provincial manager of Can You Dig It? Some of you may have known Can You Dig It? It was running in the Lower Mainland for the last decade by an organization called Possibilities, which is a community living funded organization. And really they had the vision of community gardens being an inclusive space for people to come together. So really their participants, whether that was in housing or different social programs, being part of the community through these growing spaces. So in the last year, it's been handed over to PHABC to grow and iterate. And that's kind of where I come in. So the program is shifting a little bit. It's still a community garden program that fosters inclusive neighborhoods through growing food across BC. The 4 pillars of the program are community connectedness, collective resilience, so that's social and ecological, equity and social justice, and food security. So as mentioned, community gardens have been kind of the main focus of the program, and we're kind of expanding that a bit out to be community growing spaces. So not just community gardens, boulevard gardens, commons, urban farms, really any place within city limits that's growing food as a way of building that community connection, collective resilience, social justice and equity, and food security. A lot of the work that I've been doing lately has been working with municipalities on their policies and practices to support these types of growing spaces. As some of you may know, municipalities across the province, and I'm guessing across Canada, all have their own policies and practices on how they support growing spaces within city limits. And so what we find is there's actually a lot of inequity between that. Some municipalities have really strong practices, funding and different things that support these types of programs. And some of them just, whether they don't have the capacity or they don't have the expertise at the table, don't have those types of supports. And so you have some communities that are having a lot of opportunity to grow food and connect over it, and others that don't. And so part of us supporting municipalities with their policy and practice is also building a network of learning and sharing. And so whether that is bringing municipal staff together to share kind of their successes and challenges and policies, or if it's actually looking at bringing community garden coordinators together, gardeners together to share what's going on, and being able to talk about what are they doing on the ground, what are some of the innovative things they're doing around growing food and different things like that.
Thanks, Aaron. And yeah, I just want to say that, with food, everything is so connected that both Aaron and I really work closely together. within both of our respective programs, and we're always bouncing ideas. As I'm sure all of you in your own work, looking at the complex systems that we work in, it's so important that we communicate and we try to find ways to connect and ways to leverage each other's assets and resources and capacity to supporting one another. Because I think together we're really trying to achieve the same goal here. So I just wanted to let you know that there's no way that we're going to be able to cover such a complex topic in such a short period of time, and that there will be lots of gaps in our presentation. Needless to say, I think this is just a safe space that and an opportunity for us to have a conversation. And at the end of the day, I want to think about the theme of the day, which is local action. So what can we take at the end of the day? What is this something that we can take back to our own work and our personal lives that we can learn from this conversation and take forward? So that's what we're trying to achieve. And here are the 3 topics that we're going to be covering.
Great, thanks, Richard. So food systems are really complex. We interact with them regularly through the day, and they really span the reach to individual lives. So thinking about like a family coming together, having a meal, to communities coming together through programming like community gardens or meal programs. We also talk about it at a regional level, from farms to food access. And then there's provincial and national food processing and distribution systems. And then you have global trade, foreign farm labor, and then the importation of food. So the diagram to the right is one example of how complex this subject is. And as as Richard mentioned, it's pretty much impossible to cover it all within this presentation. So we're just trying to kind of give a little high level overview to position ourselves, and then we'll focus in a little bit more on some areas that we think are really important that have been kind of flowing through the themes of the conversation today and within our work. So to conceptualize this and focus from a public health perspective, it's easier to focus on where the tensions lie. In my work, that's a really big thing. So yesterday with Wanda's session, we were talking about agri-food, and the role that public health can play is really being that convener of conversations between different ideologies, different stakeholders, different people live within the room. And so that's kind of why I want to focus on like some of the tensions. And as you see to the left, those bullet points of different ideologies versus each other. So it's really around that push and pull, and how do we actually navigate these systems to support really good policy and practices that touch as many people as possible and create system change. So in my work, local food system is constantly considered the end goal. And I actually consider this a tension because we're really reliant on a global food system. So from a policy and practice perspective, the likelihood of being completely local is actually impossible, I think, in my mind. And this is a bit of a paradox because local food systems end up becoming this big, hairy, audacious goal that we're trying to achieve. But I actually don't know if we're going to get there. And I know that's a bit of a contentious issue. And I think one of the things, and I won't be able to dive too deep into this because it's obviously a very complex conversation, but we talk about our reliance on this global food system. But I think about folks that are growing food within the global south and how reliant they are on us being able to purchase that food for their livelihood. And so if right away we shift to a completely local food system, we're actually causing a lot of harm. And so it's something that I don't think we think a lot about when we're talking about this local food system. We're not thinking about it in a global context. So when I'm talking about a global food system, I'm really talking about some ideas of efficient versus inefficient. So the more complex a food system is, I actually think the more resilient it becomes. And this, I think, centralized and decentralized is a great example of this. The global food system strives to be efficient and centralized, with several large-scale farms, transporting to maybe 1 or 2 processing centers, and then distributing to just a few grocery stores, large grocery stores. Where a local food system is a lot more complex than this. There's many different hubs in one community producing food and processing food. There's different ways of accessing this food, and there's actually different community perspectives on coming together. So there's a lot of interplay between the local food system and the global food system. So what I've done is I've provided some context. I've really painted this with massively big brush strokes. I've generalized a lot, but I really want to dive deeper into the concepts of healthy, sustainable, just, and local.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Now I'm going to be talking about what makes healthy, sustainable, just, and local food system. First, I'll talk about the first 3 points. These points are not, exclusive, and they're not the sole ingredients that make our food system healthy, sustainable, and local. But these are some that I thought about that I just wanted to bring here to your attention, which may further contribute to our dialogue moving forward. So first is like the local and seasonal foods. making sure as consumers that we are making conscious choices where possible, thinking about where our food comes from. So I can remember growing up when I'm eating rice, my parents would always tell me to eat that rice because, if I don't eat it, then the farmer who, had their blood, sweat, and tears that went into every rice grain would be sad. I know it's quite a different narrative in terms of, you eating all the food that's on our plate, but I just wanted to echo just that connection around the food that we eat. Because as I mentioned during the beginning of our conversation, we seem to be very disconnected. It seems to be just about feeding ourselves, but we know that, in terms of making that food and all the hands that went into that food production to getting to our plate, there's a lot of hands and there's a lot of processes that went into it. Think about the health of the population. Not saying that this is good food or bad food, but thinking about, making healthier choices where possible. Looking at the Canada Food Guide, eating together. I just wanted to bring this slide here. On the left is, a Korean family eating together. This is how I grew up. We sat on the ground. We had a lot of side dishes called banchan, and everything was shared. There was no such concept of my food versus your food. It was family food. And I can remember if I, didn't get my anchovies in, my mom would, use her chopsticks and make sure that I had some on top of my rice as well too. So I think about that in terms of building that community, because food isn't just about consumption. It's really also an important aspect of building families, building the social fabric. And then on the right is, I guess sort of how I conceptualize, this is my food versus your food. And when I think about potentially like the salad bar model, we have a lot of options in, what we bring to our table and what we put on our plate. But then at the end, we say, this is sort of my food, right? So how can we shift from my food versus your food to our food together? And then also looking at just food system. I thought this section deserved a section on its own because it's such a big topic. But in thinking about what a just food system is, these are the questions that I wanted us to consider. Who are the people that are a part, not only as participants, but the owners and the decision makers of the food system that we're all sort of intertwined in? Who are the influencers that really shape our food system? So Aaron, I have this slide up, so I can't see the chat box, but I just wanted to take this moment to ask the participants to think about who is represented and not represented in the food system. Who are the important stakeholders that we need to consider when we talk about a just food system? Maybe I'll just take a moment here for everyone to type in their boxes. And Aaron, I will ask that you read out those comments, please.
Just waiting for stuff to come in. So farmers, consumers, thanks Megan, Indigenous people, commercial farmers versus local farmers, corporate distributors, yeah, municipalities, grocery stores, health inspectors.
Great, and I'll just further add, like, whose voices are important to include when we talk about a just food system?
Farm workers, most vulnerable populations, seniors, people in poverty, people with disabilities, hospitals, long-term care homes, transportation of goods, rural communities, the community as a whole, government, women, schools, children. It's also thinking, something that doesn't come up, food banks within these conversations is the LGBTQ community. We talk a lot about vulnerable populations, but it always seems to be one of the populations that everyone seems to miss out on. And I always think that's a really interesting piece to reflect on, because I know tons of queer farm workers and folks. Yes, and people of all genders, of course. Great. So yeah. Homeless folks is such an important piece as well, especially with this pandemic. We're talking about encampments, where people are getting safe access to food, nature and other animals. Yeah. Great. So
Great.
Richard, do you want to keep going?
Sure. Yeah. And I also think about the BIPOC communities, the recent immigrants, refugees, and I think every other group that was mentioned here, I think we're all important decision makers and influencers that need to be part of the decision making and contributors within the process. But unfortunately, it's not always that all the people have a voice at the table. And Aaron will be covering that in the next slide.
Great. So this slide really just came up with Richard and I kind of at the very end of going through our presentation being like, how do we actually focus a bit more on these inequities? And I really want to talk about food insecurity. So food insecurity is an inequity, but focusing on food insecurity alone doesn't actually address the systemic or root cause of this food insecurity. So this is some of the reasons that I think that we keep embedding inequities within our food system. So Richard and I, as we're riffing off each other, we drafted up a few points of some of the reasons we think these inequities are happening, some of these tensions lie. So we'll go through them, and then we'd love if you were able to contribute some as well, and we'll open up for people to chat in the chat box or be able to unmute their mic and talk a little bit.
Yeah, please don't be shy. If you want to chat, please feel free to unmute at any time.
So the first one is looking around land access versus land rights. I think about Indigenous communities that have been stewarding this land since time immemorial. And then when settlers came to this land, they broke it up into parcels of land and told people, if you come here, you're able to settle the land, you're able to get that piece of land for your family. And so right there, that begins to kind of start to create this long-term inequity that we're seeing throughout our food system. But I don't think it's as simple as just the land is broken up. I think it actually gets further embedded when we talk about land access as well. A lot of the time, we're trying to create space for farmers to access this land, and most of them don't actually own the land. They end up having to lease it, and so you have these handful of wealthy families that are owning the land that people are farming on. Farming isn't lucrative, and then that's further exacerbated by the fact that land has been stolen from Indigenous communities. Richard, do you have anything you want to add to this one?
Yeah, just a comment that an Indigenous elder had said to me one time was that we became poor as Indigenous people when the colonizers came in and introduced the concept of money. And I think about money as a power dynamic and as a way to hold more versus less. The Indigenous ways and other Indigenous communities across the world really have a different perspective on and value really as family, as society, as community, as sort of a priority versus sort of individual values and how much we hold. So that's, I think, really closely tied in with the land and about the food as well too, right? Who has access to the food, who can produce the food, who has control of the food. So I think these are some of the factors that contribute to some of the inequalities and inequities.
Yeah, we talk a lot about like intergenerational wealth. So I'll just take it from my own perspective. Like my family came here a handful of generations ago. They were poor when they came here, but they were able to settle the land. And then through the generations, we've been able to acquire wealth. And so I take that and I compare it to some of the movements that are happening in the US, like the Black farmers movement, looking at reparations, saying, if these Black farmers talking about if we didn't come here as slaves and we came here as settlers, we would have intergenerational wealth. But because we came here and we're told, we have to work this land, we had no choice in it, that this ends up this is like one of the starts of the inequities that we're seeing now that have been playing out through generations. And so I think really something to think about is like, who is owning the wealth and what does our past have to do with where we are right now in society and our position of power?
Mm-hmm. And I think something that a lot of communities and organizations are trying to do in response to that is about representation, about bringing those marginalized voices to the table in decision making. But to this last point about representation versus decision making, I think about when we set up these communities organizing, when we have these groups, we say, oh, we want to have a diverse representation, and we almost have like a checklist of who we need to include. It's a check mark that we have somebody from a BIPOC, that we have somebody from LGBTQ, so on and so forth. But when it comes to decision making, I think about just because they're at that table doesn't mean that they have equal decision making power, and I think that's a really interesting and very subtle power dynamic that isn't named often enough. is that just because someone's at that table doesn't mean that they actually have the same kind of influence as somebody else. So really thinking about that push and pull again, and about who's really at that table versus who are the ones who are really, at the end of the day, making those decisions, are two separate things.
That ownership piece, really important. So we kind of want to open up to you folks. What do you see as some of the inequities within the food system? Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box.
I think there's been a conversation happening in the chat box as well.
Yeah, there has.
Aaron and I are by no means experts. We're just here to facilitate a great conversation. And we're also here to learn as well.
Hi, this is Sean Inns from Nanaimo Food Share. I just, in terms of the inequities, I think that's a really good point, in that most of the families that we're working with in terms of developing food skills and nutrition skills, in terms of our urban farming and programming, aren't actually at the table when it comes to making the decisions. And so we end up spending a lot of time. And I think PHABC does a good job of sort of demystifying a lot of the policy that's out there and helping to communicate that to the population. But then there's other food systems policy that we spend a lot of time like just saying, this is a really complex food policy, or this is a complex part of the food system. So how do we first take that and just like break it down in a way that it's going to make sense to maybe some of our low literacy customers, maybe some of our marginalized people, maybe some people that just need it broken down into kind of bite-sized steps. So that's a huge challenge for us, is just like, what policy matters to people? How do we do that? And we certainly went through this with COVID, was just even the COVID guidelines around food safety and food security, because we're working with vulnerable and lower literacy populations. We had to take everything that was coming out and then say, okay, well, many of our clients aren't online, or many of them might have verbal barriers or challenges. So we have to kind of rewrite everything that's coming out so that it makes sense. Not just so that it makes sense, but so that people that really do want to take action are ready to take action. So we're not having to spend 2 weeks saying, okay, well, this is what it means in terms of action. And now we can work with you to take action, instead of starting from a place where everyone in the community can take action on something. So that's a challenge, I think, is readiness for people to take action and participate in the food system, because it is so complex.
I think such an important piece that you touched on was around people understanding how to navigate these systems and whether their voice is actually heard. Like, a lot of the time I'll be at a table and a BIPOC person will say something and I'll say more or less the same thing, and the credibility that's taken at the table is very different. And so, not only it's like people's knowledge of how to navigate these systems, but these systems are really meant to only listen to certain voices as well, and people within those systems, because I think patriarchy plays a role in this as well.
Aaron, if I could follow up on that comment, I certainly have had that experience as a woman in information systems. I would be in a meeting representing, a finding, and people would basically just ignore it. And then when it was uttered a few minutes later by a male in the room, it would be seen as valid. So I really have had a lot of experience professionally with that exact challenge. But I actually wanted to raise a different issue, and that it has to do, and it's in connection to COVID-19, and it's in connection to the notion of mist and the potential airborne nature of the virus, and what we saw in meat rendering plants and the vulnerabilities of the workers who were involved in food production in those plants, and who were in some cases experienced loss of life. Likewise, the farmers in Essex and Windsor, Ontario, who are coming in under the worker program, and who are frightened to be tested, and who I've then had subsequent exposure to the virus, and in some cases loss of life. And so again, speaking to the notion of global inequalities, and I know we're focusing on local here, But when I think about meat rendering and I think about food insecurity and access in a crisis and the emergency preparedness and response part of that for like Vancouver Island, for example, with a 3-day food supply. So I think this is an area we need to circle in terms of emergency preparedness and response, access, food insecurity, and also worker health and workplace safety. So thanks.
Richard, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I'm just reading the comments, and I think it'll really dovetail really well with what Shannon was saying is, we're talking about access here. And I'm just going to read what Bernadette said and think that access can mean many different things. Absolutely. Money to buy, capacity equipment for food storage and prep, clean, portable water, access to transportation, and notes that in northern areas, since COVID, people have been jacking up food prices and different essential household items that really make it hard for some vulnerable families to access some of those supplies as well too. So I think that's really important when we talk about food and access, is that many people, access can mean so many different things. Access to land for gardening, harvesting of country foods, access to water for fishing. Yeah, all these things are really important when considering, and that could be a challenge as well too.
Does anyone else have any other points they would like to bring up? I think one, Shannon, that you were touching on that we didn't really talk a lot about was workers' rights and how important that is in the work we're doing. I'm thinking of COVID and all the foreign farm laborers that are coming in. I'm thinking about what happened in Jamaica, where they said if you go work on a farm outside of our country, we may not let you back in. We are not responsible for anything that happens to you. And that's really hard, especially when you're leaving your family at home and you're coming to work here. And then a lot of these folks are cramped into small spaces, similar to the meatpacking plants, right? And it's not like people can just say, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm going to get another job. For a lot of people, this is their work, and I think it's a big thing. Someone talked about skilled labor is a huge issue for many false farms. Yeah, definitely a big piece, right? When a lot of these farms have had foreign farm laborers. Susan, did you raise your hand? Do you want to say something? Just got to unmute yourself.
Okay. I want to, just because I have become so much more aware because of COVID and some of the issues that perhaps were not front and center, even though I feel like I know the food system pretty well. I think that depending on how we define locally or local, to understand, like at this moment, the blueberry farms are underwater at the moment, or how do we really communicate the issues of farmers and our local produce at critical times when the community might be able to respond in appropriate ways to either save crops or support some of the issues that are happening. So, if a raspberry producer is about to see rain coming for the next week, can we all hit the fields and pick our own? Or, just even small links to whatever it is that's happening within a community that may make a difference to the sort of year's income for people. I don't know where you position that, because of course it can be broad, a whole bunch broader, just everyone's knowledge and link and connection to farms, but just a small story.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that?
Yeah, just that one of the things that comes to mind in response to that is that the more points of communication there are in between sort of the people growing the food and the community. So if you have a farmer and they're part of a local farmers coalition, and that farmers coalition is part of a bigger, maybe region-wide initiative, and then so you have these maybe 3 or 4 points of contact in between the farmer and the community, then you sort of, I think, finding out how we streamline those points so that when a farmer has an issue, how do we connect that farmer more directly with the community so the community understands what's happening with that farmer. So, and not necessarily getting out of the way or not being involved, but where we create a more direct connection between farmers and the community. And I know that's easier said than done, but that's where we tend to find success, is when people have that really direct connection, then they become engaged in the process and engaged in the farming activity. And then they're motivated and emotionally invested in supporting that part of their community, versus it having gone through 5 different points up to a regional initiative or a larger initiative, and then coming back around to something smaller. So that's just my thought on that.
And I guess maybe one of the questions I have, like we're focusing a lot on this local small scale farmer, but I wonder, like, do folks feel like the more we proliferate local small scale farmers, the more we're going to be able to address inequities and inequalities? I don't know if I have an answer to that. I'm putting it out there.
I'm just going back to the messages that we heard this morning from Samantha around the 7 approaches and finding our way forward collectively through those principles. And I don't have the answer either, Aaron, but I do know that agency and control over food is health promoting. And so when you know that you have the money to acquire the food you need, you are calmer, you have a greater feeling of security. When you grow things, I know the harvest, the joy of harvest, I think there are many principles around agency and control that are related to being able to acquire or grow your own food. And so I think that's a premise around well-being that we could connect to. I also know that there are lots of people who don't have the capacity to engage with the soil or to even go out to market. And so a just and local food system has to address those needs and requirements. And those are the people I saw in COVID-19 who were really vulnerable. The senior who had no caregiver coming in, who had someone at home with dementia that couldn't get to the market, couldn't wait, couldn't get through on the phone lines to pre-order stuff. We have to look at the capacity to engage in the system, as well as it's not just access, it's capacity. It's that whole slide that Richard put up so beautifully about equity versus equality. We have systems that are supposed to make us more equal, but they really don't address the equity challenges. So thank you for that.
And I'll chime in, Aaron, to your question, and I'll say, I don't have the answer either, but I don't think it's about what we do, but I think it's about how we do it. And about, I'm just reading people's comments about being connected to the local farmers and the local food supply, people really working together and seeing the value of the community rather than just as, food as something that's being sold. And I think in our capitalistic society, sometimes, there is not a lot of value, like a monetary value in trying to bring the community together, right? Trying to I see a lot of community farms that are doing it out of their social good. But how does it translate, and how do we recognize that? I think acknowledgement is a big piece. And I think as people, when we see the value of local food and about the local food system, I think we're more likely to contribute and to support that as well too.
I think these are all really important points. And the chats, I've just kind of been watching it on the side as people are chatting as well. It's been really great to see the conversation that's happening. So maybe I'll pull it up a little bit. We talked a lot about these inequities. We talked about many different layers and complexities of the food system. As we know now, and as we reflect, it's a really complex thing to navigate and to work through. And how do we find our focus? And so I want to open up the conversation of what people think the role of public health is within this space, either from a personal perspective, or if you're with an organization, or just in general.
Okay, I'll jump in because I think we have an important role around presenting the evidence about where the gaps are and really operating from that evidence-based perspective and being as well a partner in innovation and supporting other voices to be heard more clearly and more fully in this discourse.
A personal local action that I can think of my end, going back to just the complexities of navigating this complex food system, and about some of the more vulnerable community members who don't have a voice at that table, is I think around education and around skills and knowledge building. So I think that's something that I'll try to I'll enact in my own practice, professionally and personally, is to work within my local community to try to build those skill sets and to build that leadership within those communities.
Hi. It really strikes me listening to this that your task, you folks, is particularly complex, and that particularly around the justice side. So the justice issues connected to food. I think the public health role, two big ones would be around public health ethics concerning Canada's reliance on migrant workers, for example. And so it's not just about the health of the consumers. If we're seriously an ethical public health sector, we should be looking at the health-related justice for the workers and the production. And I'd add to that the exploitation of other animals as well, that's a public health ethical issue that lands right on your task, which is huge. I don't envy you.
Thank you. And that's one of the teachings that I've been taught here by Elder Hereditary Chief Edward Thomas, is that, you know, we are connected to the plants, we are connected to the animals, they are relations. And I think sometimes as humans, we continually think we're removed from them and that they're ours to own and to cultivate. And I think shifting that paradigm of saying, no, we can't live without them and they can't live without us, and it's important for us to be connected. And so, you know, the teaching I was taught is, you know, the first thing you have to do when you connect to the land in Lekwungen territory is learn the name of the plants that they know the name of. So in Lekwungen, in the language that the Songhees and Esquimalt people speak, and from there you'll be able to be connected with them deeper. And so I think that's a really important piece of the work that we're doing, is realizing that we're not, food isn't a commodity, it is part of us, it is one with us. Nature isn't a commodity, it is part of us, it is one with us. And animals aren't a commodity, they're part of us and they're one with us. And moving through that.
Aaron, Diane Sanderson has put her hand up.
Oh, great, thanks Shannon. Diane, do you wanna speak?
Hi there, thanks. When you asked about what the role of public health can be here, as an environmental health officer, I wonder if there's a capacity or a way that we can help support food diversion from going into the waste. So good food that is still edible, that is still nutrition, and instead of going directly to the waste, how can we work with organizations or groups that help divert that good food to the places that it needs to go, and environmental health officers helping with whatever safety plans or concerns that there might need to be. I just feel that that's a space that we can provide some support in that.
Yeah, food waste isn't something we even touched about at all, which is a really interesting one. And I know in the capital region, the big focus we've been doing is it's important. Food waste, there's a lot of energy right now. There's actually a lot of money around it from grocery stores wanting to find a way to put their food into the community. And then when we're actually doing strategic planning, we're saying this food waste is great for now, it's meeting an immediate need, but how do we use the capacity that it's building for these distribution hubs, these systems, to slowly wean ourselves off this food waste system and focus more on local and building that capacity at the local system. And so I think that's a really important piece when we talk about food waste, that it's important to use it now, but again, it's a dumping ground for the industrial food system, and how do we use it as a way of building capacity for the local food system? Any other thoughts? Other stuff happening.
Can we talk about broadening the role of the environmental health officer in general as a public health role? I've heard this, you know, on so many occasions that the stretch and potential reach of that profession is being underutilized. Thanks.
Yeah. Shannon, so what would you imagine that looking like?
Well, I know with respect to food security, there is a potential for expanding. So the role of the EHO has, because they're involved in so many systems, air systems, land systems, water systems, all of which influence the safety and security of agricultural production. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to intensify that relationship. I think there's some opportunities around, as Dion mentioned, how we're processing and moving food forward. I think with respect to Indigenous sovereignty over food supplies and rendering of food, this has been a food security, food safety challenge for us in terms of abattoirs and how meat production is managed. I see there's some opportunities for us to enhance flexibility under the regulations while protecting and preserving public health. So I actually feel this is a much more important dialogue than we can have today in terms of applied public health professions. But I feel PHABC has work to do in outreach to EHOs and in further strengthening this conversation. And I believe, Wanda, this is an area you could really contribute to nationally as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it is a broad conversation. It was my entire dissertation. So, but I think a lot of work was starting to be done when I was still there around health equity and for environmental health officers, trying to help them to see the world through that lens, which is not something that was traditionally within their education system. So BC CDC has done a lot, or it was NCCEH has done a lot around trying to move that language forward specifically for the environmental health officers. But there is a need to continue in engaging in that relationship, and it's something that, as a public health association in Saskatchewan, for example, we don't really reach out to the environmental health officers as part of SPHA. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done across the country.
Aaron, I saw you agreed to a comment in the chat, and I think it's really important to bring it back up to the group as a whole.
Okay, so Megan, do you want to speak at all? I know you're in a place that may not have the most stable internet, so I don't know if that's why you're not chiming in.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm fine. I have lots of internet. Yeah, I'm just thinking about. There's been a lot of conversation around the food waste and food insecurity and food diversion to vulnerable populations, and we just have to remember that that's not a solution to food insecurity, and that it's not a just way to receive food, and it's not equitable. And so I agree that we need to divert food and reduce food waste, but I struggle with the thought of it going to vulnerable populations, because everybody should have access to the same food.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things, I guess when I was speaking on my point, I'm thinking about, because I do agree to that. And at the same time, I'm like, all right, well, there isn't tons of funding going to, well, more with COVID, but tons of funding going towards this work. And having inexpensive food allows us to find new ways of building different systems. And so really what I see is the role of food waste is allowing an inexpensive way, because the food is normally free, to build new and potentially stronger systems. But I know, Shannon, we've talked a lot about this. The charity model of food hampers is not equitable and creates a lot of harm and doesn't create dignified access. So I do think we have to be shifting our models of the way that we're doing food access as a whole. And I'd really be open to some insight, knowing that we only have 1 minute left, and I do want to summarize maybe a few points. So does anyone have any last thoughts? I don't, Megan, you're really an expert in this area, so. As she's shaking her head, no.
Susan has her hand up.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I think that, there's so much evidence that suggests that it really is that the response to food insecurity is ensuring that people have enough money to access quality food. So, I totally agree with Megan. I think it's just really important that we understand that and we don't build systems that keep perpetuating what doesn't work and that we know doesn't work. Even though it sort of makes sense, it doesn't get the result that we want.
Yeah, I agree to that. And I think, you know, we need to be looking at income, we need to be looking at housing, we need to be looking at the way that we're building communities and the environment as people, and really trying to shift a lot of our thinking. So again, very complex. We're gonna get called back pretty soon. Megan, do you want to say something? I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like the context of COVID and how so much funding has gone towards the Band-Aid effect and like just like a quick response, and wondering if, you know, public health's role is more in the advocacy for the, you know, if this happens again, what can we do to mitigate that? And maybe that's a role public health can play more in, is the advocacy for a deeper response.
And I think that is a beautiful summary of, in concise way, of what is that role of public health, and it is around advocacy. It's around seeing where the inequities are and finding different ways of advocating for new responses. Shannon, do you have anything you want to end on? You're always so good at summarizing.
I love this session because it really tapped all of the expertise in the room, and I think we've grown. We've got more to work with now, and I know this was a